pleasure to have Mr. Mr. Vikram Sampath is a Bangalore-based historian, author of three acclaimed books, Splendor of the Royal Mysore, My Name is Gohar Jan, and S. Balachandar. Vikram sir was awarded the Sahitya Academy First Yuva Puraskar in English Literature and the ARSC International Award for Excellence in Historical Research in New York for his book on Gohar Jan. Grab the eyeballs of the entire nation. Depending on your ideological prediction, if you are from the left, Veer Savarkar is someone who represents bigotry and prejudice. But if you are from the right, he is an iconoclast and someone who has been unsung and not given his due. Vikram sir, in his new book on Savarkar, tries to make sense of these many contradictions that have come to define Veer Savarkar. He will be in conversation with Dr. Reema Ahuja, a former minister of the NMA, National Monument Authority. She is an accomplished writer and a historian on Rajasthan. From running a cat rescue center to being a specialist on his heritage development in China, she is into several cultural and environmental issues. Her books are often quoted by scholars from India and abroad as a reliable source on the history of Rajasthan. Let's welcome them.
Thank you very much. And I welcome Vikram Sampath on stage. I know that there is a lot for him to say. Volume 1 is, I had written down how many pages it was, but never mind, it has 12 chapters, and this is just volume 1. So there will be a lot to say, but I know that there will probably be a lot of questions also. So I will keep the preamble short and go straight into it. Vikram, share with us what got you to write this particular biography. We were talking earlier, you've done a book on the history of Mysore royal family, and then of course the very famous Gohar Jan book, and now this. So you are heading maybe into biographies, but this is more than that?
Very good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here in Bhopal, and that's an interesting question to start off because everybody keeps asking me why Savarkar, and my usual response is why not Savarkar, considering the times that we live in. I think it's more appropriate that we're talking about him today in Bhopal, where just about a week or 10 days he again stoked controversy with, I think there was a pamphlet that was issued here in Bhopal by the Seva Dal, which had various allegations against this man. About his personal life and so on, and if there is one character of the past, particularly of the freedom struggle, who intrudes our modern, contemporary political discourse, Savarkar would probably be the one who intrudes at the maximum. There are proponents and opponents. In every election rally, he becomes an object of derision for someone from the Congress, and someone from the BJP has to counter that. There are defamation suits going on. Should he get the Bharat Ratna? Should he not get the Bharat Ratna? That becomes the main topic for the manifesto in the Maharashtra elections. Shiv Sena and BJP are fighting on that, their competing vote bank space. And for somebody like me who's a historian, who later went and saw what is it about this man that one can actually go and read about, both somebody who polarizes opinions so much, who draws such sharp reactions for and against. The last book that was written, a comprehensive biography of his, was way back in the 1960s. This biography by this man called Dhananjay Keer. So ever since, if you see, we've had so many re-evaluations of our freedom fighters. Almost every year there's a book on Gandhi and Nehru, and now Patel is being reimagined, re-evaluated. Bhagat Singh, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, all of them are being seen again. But then Savarkar, despite intruding our space in the way I mentioned, there is hardly any scholarly work on him. So those who both oppose him as well as support him, what are they basing their facts on? It's largely rhetoric. So there's that famous quote of Toni Morrison which says, if there is a book that you want to write and it's not been written yet, you must be the one to write it. So I think I took a cue from that and decided that this is going to be a literary quicksand that I'm stepping in, because you're going to be called names, you're going to be branded, you're going to be have to face the repercussions. But then the story is so fascinating of this man, a melange of contradictions that he is. So I think it was a story that was dying to be told. And in fact, I wanted it in 3 volumes, and my publishers, Penguin, said, it's not the trilogy series that you're going to have with thrillers, so you better restrict it to 2. So somehow I've tried to compress it to 2 volumes. The first volume covers the early part of his life from 1883 when he was born to 1924 when he was released from jail. The second volume would take the story forward from 24 to 1966 when he died.
So some of the words you used there, one is the polarization which is happening, and I think the other word you used fits in equally, which is of a historian. So there are times when whatever is happening around you is sweeping everyone along, but somebody needs to be able to take a view, whether it's dispassionate or it is polarizing in itself, and look at somebody. The other thing that you said, which is a good stepping in point again, is I know that Veer Savarkar wrote his own autobiography at one point in Marathi. Is that right? Or was it English?
It was Marathi, but
Yeah.
it was a series of lot of his
A lot of
memoirs
his.
and
But
reminiscences.
the point again is he was writing from a very young age,
Yeah.
right? And since then there were some biographies written in his time, and then as you said there was a gap. If you were to go back to that time, perhaps the polarization would not have been complete. So a lot of what has happened is to do with the times we live in. Let's go back a little into his times. You've written there. For those of you who have not yet picked up the book, there are 12 chapters in it, and very predictably, for a historian it's predictable, you started with the early years. But you also give a picture of what was happening in what is the Bombay Presidency then, Maharashtra now, at that time. So the educated Maharashtrians who had a place in the Peshwa's court, for example, were suddenly, they had no position in anywhere. You've talked very evocatively. Moving is not the word to use for a historian. Evocatively, he's drawn a picture of what is happening when plague comes, and the plague commissioner walks in. Rand is there, and he's pulling people out of their homes and old people. In all of that, we have this young boy who picks up a torn book of history. Your words from there.
Yeah, so the plague, epidemic that hits Maharashtra, that becomes a starting point for this boy. He's lost his mother by then, when he was all of 9, and the family deity, the Ashtabhuja Bhavani, becomes the mother that he confides everything with. And then the Chafekar brothers, the famous Chafekar brothers, who actually assassinate the plague commissioner there. They are executed, and that stirs this young little boy. He goes in front of the idol and takes a vow in the middle of the night, saying, "Till my last breath, I'm going to keep fighting the enemy and killing them." And actually follows it up with action too. 2 years later, his father dies to plague, but despite that, here's this young boy of 14 who establishes India's first secret society, an organized secret society, which he's thoroughly influenced not by Karl Marx and the revolutionary ideas of the Marxist paradigm, but of the Italian revolutionaries, Garibaldi, Mazzini, and so on. And just as they formed this young Italy, where young people would form these societies, smuggle arms, and then infiltrate the army, and somehow ensure you can win your army soldiers to your side. So that is what the model, drawing also from the 1857, the War of Independence, which was very similar. How do you infiltrate the British Indian Army, which is composed largely of Indians, appeal to their patriotic sentiments and bring them over? So this leads to the formation of the Abhinav Bharat, which was initially called Mitra Mela, and then very soon you see this organization growing its tentacles across the country, networking at a time when there was no WhatsApp and all of that, where with revolutionaries in Punjab, in Bengal, the Anushilan Samiti, the Aurobindo Ghosh, Prafulla Chaki, Khudiram, all of them are working in tandem to ensure there is a simultaneous uprising in different parts of India. I think that's a very, very fascinating aspect, which in our history books, how do we portray revolution and revolutionaries? They are shown as these young, hot-blooded, men who threw a few bombs here and there, got, executed for that. But the fact that there was strategy, there was actually, a coordinated attempt, there was some amount of intellect that went in, just not hot blood. So that is something that was a revelation even for me while I was going through my research on this.
But by the same token, you see, it is the making of somebody. What happens in your mind when you're growing up and all of this is happening around you. Because he's taking a lot of inspiration also from the small groups of local Maharashtrians who are, trying to come together to do things and to take armed action. At the same time, he's got this bent of mind where he's rejecting superstition, he's rejecting a lot of things. He could have been a social reformer in another day and age almost, because you talk about how he used to play with other children of the village, and they allowed it because they called him Chote Zamindar and allowed that. But otherwise, the caste-ridden society, if it hadn't been for his father's older brother who laughed it off, I think the boys could have got beaten up, and so there are things like that happening in the making of this young boy. But to come back to what fascinated me, that from the bookshelf, the family bookshelf, he picks up a book, and it's a history book. But the early pages have been torn, and that gets him thinking of what do we really know of early history. We only know what we have been told and what happens before. And again, I can see the shades of the archaeologist in him. So once upon a time, their family had been well off, and they had a house with 9 courtyards. By the time he's born, they don't have that. But every time something is excavated, he thinks he's going to find one of those courtyards. So you have this vulnerable young boy who then is also a prolific reader, a debater. Doesn't he win a prize at a very young age and they think he couldn't have written it?
Yes,
Want to share that?
I mean, he also starts writing poetry, Marathi poetry at the age of 7 or 8. Some of the most classical, poems in Arya meter, OV meter of Moropant and other stalwarts of the Marathi literature. And in his memoirs, he very candidly also talks that he takes these samples of poetry to his teacher, and the teacher laughs at him and says, just by stringing some words together, do you think you're going to become a great poet? Little did the teacher know that this boy is going to grow up and become one of the, if he were not a political figure, he would have been one of the most, eminent Marathi literatures. Somebody who contributed the most to the also the Bhasha Shuddhi, the Shuddhikaran of Marathi itself. Many of the words like Digdarshak, which you find in movies, even there's talk that Doordarshan, all these words were actually coined by him to purify the language and bring those words which you don't have to depend on Urdu or English and all of these. So somebody who contributed so much to the growth of the language as well. And his father was someone who would actually read to him books written by Western philosophers. So at a very early age, he's also being exposed to thinkers from the West, as also scriptures of India, and all of this creates an impact on him. And the best part is, in all those meetings that he has with his comrades in the society, that revolutionary society, they're discussing all of this together, and people of different castes, and he being an upper caste Chitpavan Brahmin, always felt that it is good to live in cooperation rather than competition. So sharing that knowledge that he gained, by reading all of this is shared with all of them. And there's also references of how they would study together also for the exam, so that just participating in revolution doesn't ensure in lower grades in school. So I think it's a complex mix of many contributive factors to this boy's growth.
And clearly a boy with a very, very sharp intellect, who is equally, he's influenced by a lot of people, but his older brother is like companion, leader, friend, and the older brother is basically, I think, mentally into Sufi. Well, I don't know what's the right word, but he's into meditation, deep meditation.
He actually disparagingly talks about him, saying this man he's so gullible. Any saint who comes and offers him something, he's willing to spend all his money on him. And the elder brother Baba Rao, he actually wants to take up sannyas and go away to Vivekanand's ashram in Mayapur, and then finally
ends up in Kalapani.
Ends up becoming a revolutionary, and then rotting in Kalapani along with his younger brother. And the two brothers don't even know that they are in the same jail for several years before they actually meet there accidentally. So and another figure who I think influences him a lot is his elder brother's wife, Yeshu Vahini. who becomes they're almost of the same age, but considering he's lost his mother very early, she becomes a motherly figure as also a sister. He teaches her English. So a lot of things that women should not have education and so on. He fought for that right from that age, and which translates later in his life when he carries on social reforms in Ratnagiri in Maharashtra, where he strives for women's emancipation as well. So these two share a very, very unique bond, the Savarkar and his sister-in-law Yeshu.
And the brother, of course, as you mentioned. Again, I think because people are definitely interested in a later part of it. But before we move towards that, he is in Britain. There's a trial going on. Let's talk about 1910 because it's almost like a scene out of a movie, except it's not. It's something real that happened.
Yeah.
Somebody gets, sentenced and somebody tries to escape. And
Right.
let's talk about July 8th, thereabouts, or before and after that.
A little bit before that, maybe. So
Share the context.
Yeah, as I mentioned, so he after forming this first secret society of the country, which grows its tentacles all over India, he then moves away to Pune first, to the Ferguson College to do his graduation, and there comes directly under the tutelage and influence of Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and organizes the first ever student bonfire of foreign clothes in India. In 1905, and at that time in opposition to the partition of Bengal by Lord Curzon. And for the first time, someone is actually giving a call for total and complete freedom and nothing less than that. If you see, even the Congress, the moderate faction, the extremist faction, they were not talking about total independence till then. They were talking of concessions from the government. The extremist faction was talking about responsive cooperation and so on. But the revolutionary, stream led by Savarkar was actually espousing the cause of complete freedom. While Purna Swaraj as an article of faith comes for the Congress 25 years later in 1930. Now, shortly after that, he gets a scholarship and goes away to London to study law, and the India House in London becomes like a hotbed of sedition, so to say, and some of the most fascinating characters of world history whom we sadly don't have any reference or mention of in our history textbooks. Shyamji Krishnavarma, Madam Bhikaji Kama, Virendranath Chattopadhyay, Madan Lal Dhingra, Lala Hardayal and the Gadar Party, MPT Acharya, VVS Iyer, Sukhsagar Dutt, Sikandar Hayat Khan, all of these people are sitting there in London, in Paris, and plotting for the freedom of this country. And why abroad? Because the sedition laws were so strong in India, like they are now perhaps, then where anything written against the government you would be sent off to Kalapani. So there it was much more simpler to actually carry on propaganda against the colonial government. So all of them are doing this across, and Savarkar posits himself as the center point of this whole drama, that is intercontinental drama with surveillance, with Scotland Yard spies who are following them everywhere. Every little bit that they're doing is tracked. And sitting there, he also provides, most importantly, the intellectual corpus for revolution with two books that he writes. The first is a translation of Joseph Mazzini's biography into Marathi, Joseph Mazzini Yanche Atmacharita va Rajkaran, and more seminally, his epochal book on the 1857 war. In fact, he coins the word the first war of Indian independence, because till then it is always called the Sepoy Mutiny by the British. So 2 years he spends in the British Library in London, uses all their documents, their archives, and gives Indian history a perspective written by Indians for Indians itself, and not colored by colonial prejudice. And this book, it becomes a landmark in itself. The first book probably in the history of world literature which gets banned even before it is published. So the British get to hear about the manuscript, and they say none less than the Viceroy of India actually writes that at no cost this book should reach Indian shores, and Sea Customs Act is put. So the revolutionaries plan this fantastic game of how to conceal them in these false bottom boxes. On the top there is something else, a double barrel box. At the bottom you have all these manuscripts. Along with that, Browning pistols and bombs, bomb manuals which are smuggled from London. And on the top you have something else, and it's all covered with cryptic names, Christmas presents, Don Quixote papers, the Pickwick Club papers, and all kinds of things, and escaping customs across different countries. The manuscript comes. In fact, the manuscript comes first to his elder brother. He takes it to Sholapur, to the printing press. The government gets hang of it. They pursue the press. The brother retrieves the manuscript, sends it back to London. Then from there it goes to Paris. Somehow the French police also get to know about the manuscript. Then it is then taken to Germany to get published, because there you have a lot of Indology and Devanagari script, but then the German printing press makes a mess of it with the Marathi book. Finally it is taken to Belgium, all the while circumventing customs officials and surveillance, and finally it is published there and smuggled back to India, and translations are made into English and other languages, and this book almost becomes like a Bible for revolutionaries till 1947. You have Bhagat Singh actually publishing the second edition of this book, and he makes it almost an entry criteria for anybody who joins the HSRA, saying, have you read Savarkar's First War of Independence? Because there he exactly defines what a revolution is, and what are the motivational factors of a revolution, and what is the end result that one should expect. And 20 years later, you have none less than Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, who gets copies of the book published from languages right from Tamil to Japanese. So though Savarkar himself might have branched out of revolution, his book continued to be such an epochal book. And it warms my heart as a writer that somebody who never wielded a gun himself or a weapon himself, his pen was mightier than the sword, probably. And so the British actually feared him, and he was categorized as a D category or a dangerous criminal. So they put up several cases against him. He's actually booked under the Fugitive and Offenders Act, whereas he was not a fugitive. He was a bona fide student who was studying there on scholarship. But then he goes to Paris, they pursue him there, then he comes back to London. Right at the railway station, he's arrested, and at any cost they want him back to India, because in India they can ensure that he is finished for life, whereas in London he could still manage to escape. So a very unfair trial is done, and he's sent back to India. And on the way to India, when the ship is docking at this port of Marseille in France, in the ship too, they're always under he's always under surveillance. There are 2-3 guards who are keeping track of what he's doing, including when he's going to the toilet. But despite that, when the ship is docking at Marseille, he opens the porthole of the lavatory and then jumps into the ocean. And being a good lawyer, he knows the law and how to use that for his release. This becomes a case of arbitration, just like what's happening now in the Jadhav case between India and Pakistan, because his contention was, I was a British criminal, so to say, but then now I have stepped onto French soil. So Britain has lost its rights over me, and it's up to France to either give me asylum or hand me over to the British. Now the very fact that Britain and Churchill, who was the Home Secretary, writes, at any cost we want this man back in our clutches. We can't afford him to be set off, because that's going to inspire all the other revolutionaries whom they called as anarchists. So they arm twist France to such an extent that France loses this case in the International Court of Justice at Hague, and then he's captured, he's brought back to India. The Nashik conspiracy case and Nashik murder case trials happen with no jury, with no right to appeal. And then he slapped the maximum sentence that probably anybody had in the history of our freedom struggle, which is of 2 transportations for life, which accounts for 50 long years. So he's a young man of 27, and as a punishment, all his degrees are withdrawn from him. He loses his BA degree from Fergusson College. The law degree that he studied for 5 years in London, that is stripped off him. So all that he has, even to this day, on his record is a metric pass. Despite doing his law studies from London. So, and then in the court it is said, and I quote that in the book as well, that when the judge reads out this sentence, that you are going to be sentenced for 50 years, he stands up and says, I thank you, my honor, that you are giving me this sentence, because that confirms the Hindu philosophy of reincarnation. I can get 2 transportations for life only if I have 2 lives. So some way the British court has actually acknowledged the Hindu philosophy of Punarjanma. So, I mean, it's quite a thing to actually take a sentence like that with that kind of a spirit, and then he's of course packed off to Kalapani.
Yeah, before we follow him to Kalapani in matter of speech, when he is put back onto that ship, what caught my eye and has stayed in my mind is he promptly sits down and begins to meditate and recite. You know, he's got
And writes a poem.
And he's
Anadi
doing
me, Anant me, I'm immortal. So every time when he is actually, struck by disaster, right, from the death of his mother to when he's caught back, and also in Kalapani, in the cell, poetry and literature becomes his, saving grace, so to say, along with, of course, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which he reads to keep his sanity. And the kind of tortures that, Savarkar and several other political prisoners undergo in Kalapani, it's something I've vividly, and it's distressing to even write that or read that.
So
but
that is
I think it
something-
must be mentioned.
That is something that again we need to talk about when today you have a polarized society. He's bad or he's good or he's this or he's that. That he is part of this group of Indians who are protesting against being occupied by another power and who are fighting for freedom. And irrespective of their religion, they're all in it together. And that is a recognition, I think, that people in India had definitely in the 50s and 60s. So something has happened. I know we will be running out of time soon. So a couple of questions that I want to leave you with, and maybe the audience would want to follow up on also. What kind of a takeaway can we have, which is a very simplistic way of doing it, of the life of someone who is dedicating himself, whether it is this individual that we are talking about or the hundreds of others, young men and women of that time, who know that they may not be a tomorrow. And there wasn't for several people. At Kalapani, there wasn't for several. And then we sit in judgment on them today.
True.
And then we
From
look
the cozy confines of our homes.
but we also use that to then create more dysfunction because of the way we want to look at things. We want to color them in our own way. But India never had a black and white. We always have the ifs and buts. So your take, and then we open it.
I think it's important. Let me take a couple of minutes to just talk also about the life at Kalapani, because I'm sure that also has never been a narrative in our history textbooks at all. I don't even remember reading about it while I was a student in school. This was literally a hellhole for our freedom fighters, our ancestors. Even the basic human facilities of good food, a toilet facility, none of that was made available to our freedom fighters. The food that was served to them would be mixed with pieces of reptiles and snakes and all kinds of things, eating which most of them would end up with diarrhea. And I'm really sorry talking about this, but I think we as a nation need to know. The nation needs to know. But then this diarrhea that would end up with, they would only have fixed time of even going to the toilet. Just imagine, there's just one time in the day, morning, and once in the evening. So any other time you would not be allowed. So most of the prisoners, they would actually end up defecating in their own cells and sitting, eating, sleeping amidst their own squalor. And in the heat of Port Blair, they would be given this terrible punishment of Kolhu Ka Bail, where that oil grinding mill, where you had to go round and round that and full day extract 30 pounds of oil. And if you, at the end of the day, that would be weighed, and if it is not 30 pounds, you would be whiplashed, you would not be given dinner, which anyway they wouldn't want to eat. And then the clothes that would be given to them were made of these gunny sacks, so most of them would end up with skin rashes or leeches biting on them, and they would be denied medical treatment. So, and Savarkar too, I mean, they were not even given pen and paper to write, so he actually uses his nails and writes all the poetry on the walls of the jail. Mind you, 6,000 lines, not 10 or 20, 6,000 lines of verses of those classic poems of Marathi literature, Kamla, Saptarshi, and so on. And just to spite him, the jailer Barry, who's like this lord of hell in that hellhole, comes and whitewashes in front of his eyes all that he has written. And little did he know that this man had such an elephantine memory that he had committed all of that to memory, and when he comes out of jail, he gets all of this published, and we still have those poems amidst us today. So this kind of torture, which many young men, they were all teenagers, they were 18, 19, early 20s, and most of them would either go insane. There was an entire asylum that was set up, a lunatic asylum that was set up in Haddo Island in Port Blair, only to cater to our forefathers who lost their mind because of the kind of tortures, and many of them would also consume poison and commit suicide. Indu Bhushan Roy and several others, Ulaskar Dutt, who goes mad. So all these people, their memoirs speak to us even today, and I quote that, and Savarkar himself writes about these tortures for several years. It's not just a day or two, but 11 years, 15 years. It's impossible for us to even imagine today, as you said. And it's so easy for us today to sit in free India, where we can breathe and talk what we want, to pass judgments about these people, about what they should have done, could not have done. Anybody is caught today, including our politicians, the next day they will get sick and get admitted to a hospital or apply for anticipatory bail, which they somehow manage to get if they are powerful enough. And here was a system which would not allow these people to come out of jail alive. And that was the whole idea, to break the back and the spirit of these revolutionaries. And it was circumventing all of this that many of them fought for our freedom. And the least I think we can do is at least not insult them. If we cannot acknowledge them or remember them, which is itself a travesty with truth and with their memory, the least we should do is not actually talk disparagingly about them, especially when we don't know the historical facts.
I think on that sober note, let's open this to
Dr. Kapil Bhargav, and thank you so much for delivering such a kind good speech. मैं हिंदी में थोड़ा कंफर्म रहूँगा, अच्छा कंफर्ट रहूँगा. तो पहला प्रश्न मेरा ये है कि आपने जैसे बात की सावरकर जी के समय पे कि महिला शिक्षा के विषय में उन्होंने भी बहुत सारी चीज़ें की. उसी समकालीन एक नाम और आता है सावित्रीबाई फुले जी का. तो क्या भारत में जो नारी शिक्षा का जो सिनेरियो आपने बताया, क्या ये समस्या पहले से ही विद्यमान थी, या कोई ऐसे कारण आए जिनके कारण नारी शिक्षा का बैक में जाना पड़ा और फिर उसके लिए रिवोल्यूशन की आवश्यकता पड़ी? तो इस मिथ क्या है और सच्चाई क्या है, थोड़ा उस पर आप प्रकाश डालेंगे. और एक और प्रश्न रहेगा कि जो फ्रीडम के लिए सावरकर जी ने फाइट की, और आज भी बहुत सारी आवाज़ें फ्रीडम के लिए उठ रही हैं, बहुत तरह की फ्रीडम्स, तो इन दोनों में वास्तविकता क्या है, थोड़ा उस पर प्रकाश आप डालेंगे तो अच्छा लगेगा.
Of women's education, women's emancipation, and I think it's not directly linked with the subject that we're talking about. The second question is, I think, more relevant, where he himself talks about, and often we hear this. So if you're a revolutionary, then today are you going to support, say, the terrorists in Kashmir, or are you going to support the Naxals who are also going to pick up the gun? So about that, in his own book, he himself writes, and I think that is pertinent as an advice from the man himself, that as long as you deny us a constitution, and he's talking about the British, as long as you deny us a constitution, we have to get together in the dark. As long as you deny us our rights, we have to do what we do, pick up the gun and get it. And we have no other option but to do that. But then it is a far greater crime, he says, that when there is a constitution, when there is a system of government, to still take up the arms against it. And so that is something that he says he doesn't approve of. So I think today that becomes a important context where we may have differences of opinion with any political party, with any government or whatever else, but then we must ultimately believe that today the government of India or government of any state is not the same as the British government. We can overthrow that through the collective will of the people and through the power of our vote. And every 4-5 years there can be a change in governments. Nowadays, earlier than that, given all the unstable coalition governments that we have. So that being the case, there is absolutely no place for violence against the system, and to justify that using revolutionaries as a ploy, which is what most of them do. They use Bhagat Singh, they use all these icons, saying they also picked up the gun. But then against whom they picked up and in what context, and what do these people today do? I think that difference is very, very important in my view.
सर, मेरा नाम जिस समय से जिस समय तक के लिए आपने किताब लिखी है, उसमें नो डाउट कि सावरकर जी एक देशभक्त थे या क्रांतिकारी थे, बट लेकिन जो पार्ट आपने नहीं लिखा बाद का, आफ्टर जेल, तो उसमें तो काफ़ी सारी कंट्रोवर्सी है और जैसे कई सारे फैक्ट भी निकल के आते हैं कि जो जेल जैसे जेल में पेंशन के लिए आता है कि जेल से निकलने के बाद 60 रुपये पेंशन भी मिलता था, उसके भी एविडेंस निकल के आते हैं और भी सारी चीज़ों के निकल के आते हैं। उस समय के बाद जो उनने हिंदुत्व किताब लिखी, उसके बाद कंट्रोवर्सी क्रिएट हुआ, डिवाइड एंड नेशन जो बात हुई, और उसके बाद जो उसमें रेवोल्यूशन पास हुए, हिंदू उसने और मुस्लिम लीग ने मिलके जो बंगाल में सरकार बनाई और कॉलिशन पास हुआ ट्यूनेशन थ्योरी का, उसी के बाद तो सारी कंट्रोवर्सी है। लेकिन आपकी किताब में वो सब कंट्रोवर्सी नहीं है, तो उस कंट्रोवर्सी के बारे में आप क्या कहना चाहेंगे सावरकर जी को लेके?
इन्होंने वॉल्यूम 2 जो आएगा, और शायद अगले साल जब आप भोपाल लिटरेचर फेस्टिवल में मुझे बुलाएंगे तो तब तक वो किताब भी आ जाएगी शायद, और तब उसके बारे में बात कर सकते हैं। पर संक्षिप्त में मैं बोलूँगा कि जो आपने बताया 60 रुपीज़ का पेंशन, ये सिर्फ उनके लिए नहीं था, ये बहुत सारे और लोग थे जिनको I'm more fluent in English, so I'll switch to English. A lot of others who were, like I mentioned, his degrees were taken away from him, his entire property was confiscated, there was nothing that his family could actually do. So, and this was the case not only with him but several other revolutionaries. So if you see the records which are there at the National Archives, you have several revolutionaries who were given, whose everything was taken away from them, and then they were given, they were released by the government. There was no way that they could find employment. You don't have a degree or a graduation. How will you survive and take care of your family? You have wife and children and everyone to take care. So the government would give pension to several people, not only him but others also, who as a this thing of rehabilitating them and getting them into the so-called mainstream. Now this issue of we are running short. So this issue of Hindutva, etc. too, I think there's a context in which everything has to be seen. Now he writes this book, Essentials of Hindutva, in 1923, sitting in jail in Ratnagiri, and I feel personally that this was a response to a very dangerous movement that was happening in India then, which was a Khilafat movement, which was for the first time, I think, religion comes into politics in a very dangerous manner. And of course with all the good intentions of creating that Hindu-Muslim unity and so on, but then mobilizing a group of people in India to fight on a communal basis to liberate a Khilafat or a caliphate in thousands of kilometers away in Turkey, and then assuring these people that within 1 year we will establish a Khilafat in Turkey. Now that movement just had no logic. I mean, Britain had won this kingdom in war, and we were a slave nation, a colony. So a group of people here raising jhandas and fighting for it. I mean, the British were not obliged to accede to those demands. So, but then they were mobilized communally, and what happens when you have mobs which are communally surcharged and mobilized? Even the person who's leading the mob is not able to control it, like what we saw in Ayodhya. So that's exactly what happened in the 1920s, where Hindu-Muslim riots, communal riots across the country. You had the Mopla carnage in Malabar in 1921, Gulbarga, Kohat, Panipat, Delhi, Calcutta, Bengal, different parts of India saw perhaps the worst of communal riots in its history. And it was a precursor. The seeds of partition were sown during the Khilafat movement, this pan-Islamist pandering that was being done. So I think somebody needed to give an intellectual answer to that, and that is precisely what he did by defining who a Hindu is, which is not the same as a religion. In fact, in his book itself, in the very first paragraph, he says, I have nothing to do with the theological aspects of Hindu religion. He was an atheist. He didn't believe in rituals. He was an anti-caste, anti-ritual sort of a person. So he says, I have nothing to do with rituals. But then my Hindutva, defines culturally and nationally who is a Hindu. Sindhu, Sindhu Paryanta. Everybody who's staying in this geographical mass between the Indus river and the ocean. Everybody who considers this land as the land of their forefathers, and also a land that they swear their allegiance to, by considering it a holy land, not holy in terms of religion, but something that they have their loyalty towards. That I don't have extra territorial, allegiance to some country thousands of kilometers away, but to this part of land. That person becomes a Hindu, not by terms of religion, but as a cultural and a identity marker. So that is the manner in which Hindutva actually comes together. And very briefly, to also address your point about two nation and all that. Now, two nation theory was actually espoused first by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. That was 10 years before Savarkar was even born. In 1930, you had none other than Muhammad Iqbal, the famous poet, who talks about that and his conceptualization of what Pakistan is. I think the man himself talks to us in his speeches as the president of the Hindu Mahasabha, where he says, my concept of that Hindu Rashtra, which is the demon in the room for everybody, is one where everybody is equal in front of the eyes of the law. There is no discrimination on the basis of race, religion, gender, community, and so on. A majority community will not get extra privileges for being a majority, and on the same lines, a minority is not going to get extra concessions because they are numerically less. And he in fact says, if our minority brethren have even a ghost of suspicion that their cultural, religious and linguistic rights will be entrenched upon by the state, then we will assure them that none of that will be done, and the state will actually intervene to ensure that they will protect their rights. But then keep your religion to your house. Let's not bring the religion into the streets, into politics, into the public realm. So that was his idea of Hindutva, which sadly and nobody understands. And the other point is, he was never a part of the RSS, and people who condemn him always consider it synonymous. He and the RSS had differences of opinion on several issues. So the Hindutva that Savarkar espoused, the Hindutva that the RSS propagated, and probably the violent Hindutva which someone like a Godse, unfortunately followed, these are very, very different versions, and that nuance to understand historical narratives is very important. Today we have no space for that. We paint everything by the same brush.
I think, Vikram, we can listen to you for longer, but we wait for the next book. आपने जैसा कि सुना कि हर चीज़ के इतने आयाम होते हैं कि उनको समझे बिना उनके बारे में जब तक हम लोग बातचीत नहीं करते हैं तो और समझने में मुश्किल होती है। एक चीज़ जो इनकी किताब से है कि जो इन्होंने 1923 तक 24 तक का दिया है, उसके लिए दस्तावेज़ों का इस्तेमाल किया है, तो वो एक बहुत फ़ायदा रहा है सब में। और मुझे उम्मीद है कि अगली किताब में भी आप उस तरह से ही वो करेंगे कि वो जो जिस चीज़ की आप बात करते हो उसके प्रमाण साक्ष्य साथ रहते हैं। Having said that, thank you all for being a wonderful.
एक लास्ट क्वेश्चन
सर, क्वेश्चन पर है, आराम से आप तसल्ली से पूछिए।
I'm really sorry. I would request Brigadier Sanjay Agarwal